From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
In a single day, one of the poorest countries in the world did something no Western democracy dared to. They abolished the right to permanently sell land. And just like that, the United States cut off aid. In April 2025, while global headlines were still dominated by wars, markets, and the endless hum of Western elections, a young military captain in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, made a declaration that would flip global real estate politics on its head. Land is not a commodity. It is memory. It is survival. It belongs to the people, forever. The footage was raw and unforgettable. Women wept in front of crumbling government offices as they received handwritten documents declaring their right to farm, to live, to return. Entire families that had once fled to Europe or Libya were now planting their first seeds, literally, on land once auctioned off to foreign investors. Western media called it economic suicide. But across the streets of Ouagadougou, there was dancing, drumming, and a word passed from mouth to mouth: freedom. But what exactly happened behind the scenes, and why should the entire world pay attention? Before there was hope, there was silence, and buried beneath that silence was land, taken, traded, and lost without consent. For decades, Burkina Faso was a textbook example of how land in Africa was commodified, often violently. Villages where generations had lived were quietly cleared out after foreign-backed development projects received discreet approval in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. What locals called ancestral land, governments labeled unused territory. A mother's cassava plot became a mining concession. A child's playground turned into a soybean field for export to Europe. No protests made it to CNN, no tweets went viral, and no one seemed to care, except the people whose lives were crushed beneath the logic of investment. Few people realize that many of these land deals were signed not in dusty villages, but inside Western embassies, under the glow of corporate handshakes. That was the mini twist Traoré exposed early on. He didn't just criticize land corruption, he named it, mapped it, and linked it to specific Western banks, development agencies, and mining conglomerates, some of whom were sponsoring scholarships and summits on African empowerment. You ever heard of a town losing its entire rice field because of a strategic partnership signed in a foreign language? Tell me below, have you or someone you know experienced land loss in silence? But buried truths don't stay buried forever. And in 2022, something shifted. And it began with a uniform, a rifle, and a refusal to obey. No one expected a revolution to begin with a simple sentence on state TV. From this day forward, no land in Burkina Faso shall ever be permanently sold. On the morning of April 17, 2025, Ibrahim Traoré stood in full uniform, unflinching, as he delivered what would later be called the Declaration of the Soil. There were no Western advisors behind him, no smiling photo ops, just a short, electrifying message. We will no longer sell our mothers' graves. We will no longer lease our future to those who do not live it. With that, Burkina Faso became the first country in modern history to constitutionally ban the permanent sale of land. Overnight, thousands of foreign-held leases were revoked or placed under renegotiation. Dozens of mining and agribusiness contracts were frozen. Real estate websites across Europe and China quietly delisted West African parcels. Panic began to brew, not in the streets of Ouagadougou, but in the boardrooms of Paris, Washington, and Dubai. This wasn't just policy, it was a declaration of civilizational intent, and it sent one clear message: Africa is not for sale. In Vietnam, land belongs to the people but managed by the state. In Cuba, private property is constitutionally restricted. In Burkina Faso, the people now own the law itself. If your country suddenly banned the permanent sale of land, no more luxury condos, no more flipping farmland, would you support it? Be honest. Share your view in the comments. But declarations, no matter how powerful, don't feed families. The question was, could this radical act actually change lives on the ground? In a village once erased from Google Maps, Fatoumata held a wrinkled land certificate in her hands and cried. Not because she understood the legal jargon, but because for the first time in her life, she had proof that her home could not be taken away. For generations, rural women like Fatoumata were invisible in the language of land law. Titles were passed between men. Deals were made over their heads. When foreign investors arrived, it was their cassava, their maize, their dignity that vanished. But under Traoré's reform, entire communities, especially widows and single mothers, were prioritized for land redistribution. In the northern province of Yatenga, a women-led cooperative reopened its abandoned peanut processing plant just 2 months after receiving reclaimed land. No middlemen, no foreign manager, just 43 women, a crumbling machine, and full ownership. "What good is empowerment?" one of them asked, "if I have no soil to plant my name into?" In Bobo Dioulasso, a group of jobless youth turned a plot of confiscated land into an urban garden. Within 90 days, they were supplying lettuce and onions to 4 city markets, and earning more than they did during their years of migration to Europe. The effect wasn't isolated. Across the country, farmers previously evicted by extractive projects returned to find their land restored, often with tools and legal training provided by grassroots organizations. It wasn't perfect. Corruption and chaos still lingered. But there was momentum. And more importantly, there was dignity. Even city dwellers in informal settlements began to organize. In the outskirts of Ouagadougou, one man told local radio, "They used to call us squatters. Now the law calls us citizens." Would you believe it if I told you a group of widowed women in Burkina Faso just built a peanut oil factory on land they never thought they'd own? What does that say about what's possible when land stops being a privilege? But not everyone was celebrating. In the capitals of Europe, in the halls of global finance, something far less joyful was unfolding. 3 days after the land decree, the U.S. State Department issued a statement expressing concern over legal instability in Burkina Faso. 2 weeks later, $74 million in development aid was quietly suspended. The response from the West was swift and strategic. News outlets branded the reform as land populism. Think tanks published urgent reports warning of investment deterrence. The IMF declined to comment, but off-record, one advisor called Traoré's move an existential threat to free market land economics. Meanwhile, France, whose companies controlled over a third of Burkina Faso's mining rights, froze technical assistance programs. Belgium halted a renewable energy project. The EU began reviewing all trade agreements involving land-linked commodities. This wasn't diplomacy. It was punishment. But here's the twist. Most of the Western anger wasn't about law. It was about precedent. If one poor, landlocked country could pull this off, what stopped others? What if Niger followed? What if Mali rewrote its land code? What if African land, worth trillions in untapped value, slipped out of the global investment machine? Inside Burkina Faso, not everyone stood with Traoré. Urban elites, many of whom owned property portfolios in Ouagadougou and abroad, called the reform reckless. There were protests in the capital. One banner read, "Land without buyers is land without progress." The critique wasn't without merit. Some farmers worried about bureaucracy replacing corruption. Others feared the state would become the new landlord. A few international NGOs even accused the government of using land as a political weapon, rewarding allies, punishing critics. But for every televised protest, there were 10 quiet celebrations off camera. in villages far from policy desks, where the law had finally bent toward the forgotten. So be honest, are powerful nations angry because they care about the people of Burkina Faso, or because they just lost the deed? Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear from you. Reform is easy to announce, harder to implement. The next test? Turning idealism into systems and slogans into enforceable law. A revolution without infrastructure is just poetry. Traoré knew this, and so after the speeches and the cheering came something far more dangerous: paperwork. Burkina Faso's new land code didn't just declare principles, it built mechanisms. A nationwide digital land registry was launched within 3 months of the decree. Simple, free, open access. Every citizen could now verify land status with a fingerprint and a phone. No lawyer, no middleman, no waiting 6 months for an approval letter from someone's cousin in the ministry. Local governments were forced into uncomfortable transparency. Land officers, long shielded by chaos and bribes, were required to publish every transaction publicly. And if they didn't? Citizens could report them via an SMS hotline managed by a rotating committee of farmers, teachers, and civil servants. The state didn't just change the law, it changed who got to enforce it. In the village of Zorgho, 64-year-old farmer Amadou received a text message confirming his land rights. He wept, not because of the phone, but because for the first time in his life, the law had spoken in his language. Training centers began popping up across the country, teaching land literacy, community mediation, and cooperative farming models. Farmers learned how to access microcredit using biometric land IDs. Widows learned how to draft inheritance plans. Youth collectives were granted digital plots via blockchain-backed contracts, eliminating dispute and fraud. Was it perfect? Far from it. But the system was working, and more importantly, it was working for people who had never been seen by systems before. Imagine this. What if you could verify your land deed with a fingerprint instead of a bribe? Would you want that in your hometown? Let me know, because maybe it's time we asked why that isn't normal everywhere. But Burkina Faso wasn't operating in a vacuum. Other countries were watching, some in fear, others in quiet admiration. They laughed at him. Then they paused. And now, some are copying him. At first, Burkina Faso's land revolution was dismissed as a rogue anomaly. Another failed African experiment, as one European investor privately remarked. But within 6 months, quiet ripples began to spread across the continent. In Mali, a group of lawmakers proposed a bill to cap foreign land ownership. Senegal's rural councils demanded renegotiation of existing agricultural leases. Even in Zimbabwe, where land reform had long been weaponized by elites, activists cited Traoré's model as proof that it could be done right, if driven by people, not politics. And outside Africa? In Latin America, peasant movements in Colombia and Brazil began referencing Burkina Faso in their manifestos. One Bolivian mayor tweeted, "If the poorest country in West Africa can digitize land justice, what's stopping us?" Here's the irony. The free market West, which once exported its models to the global South, is now watching those very models be rewritten from the soil up. China stayed quiet, but quietly it took notes. State-backed researchers from Beijing requested meetings with Burkina Faso's new land commission. They didn't condemn the reform. They studied it. Vietnam, Cuba, even parts of India, places with long histories of state land control, began to publicly debate whether people-first anti-speculative land models could actually deliver better stability than freehold capitalism. Meanwhile, UN special rapporteurs praised Burkina Faso's digital land registry as a potential case study in equitable governance. What began as an isolated experiment was becoming a mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw. So what do you think? Is this a reckless disruption of free markets, or a long overdue reset of global land justice? Leave a comment. Your perspective matters more than you think. But behind every global theory lies a local consequence. And in Burkina Faso, those consequences were just beginning to unfold. Land isn't just soil. It's memory, power, wealth, and war. When you change who owns it, you don't just rewrite laws, you redraw loyalties. Economically, the reform sent shockwaves. Foreign direct investment dropped by 38% in the first 2 quarters. Several real estate firms declared losses. Export projections shrank. But inside the country, smallholder agricultural output rose, slowly but steadily. Local markets expanded. More food was grown for domestic use than for cargo ships. Culturally, something deeper was happening. In schools, children began learning not just about geography, but about the history of land theft, resistance, and recovery. A new national holiday was proposed, Soil Day. Artists, poets, and musicians returned to rural areas, capturing a story that felt ancient yet newborn. Politically, however, the storm hadn't passed. Traoré's critics warned of future instability. Some accused him of paving the way for authoritarianism through populist nationalism. Others, especially from the diaspora, raised a difficult question. What happens when you give people land, but the economy around them doesn't change fast enough to sustain it? From a U.S. investor's lens, the move looked like a capital catastrophe. From the lens of a young farmer in Burkina Faso, it looked like finally being seen. Which one is right? Or are both just telling different truths? Some Western analysts began asking whether freehold ownership, often treated as sacred, was ever truly suited to societies recovering from colonization. Others warned that romanticizing state-led reform risked masking abuses. But for many in Burkina Faso, the question wasn't theoretical. It was immediate, lived, and visceral. Would you rather be broke but free on your own land? Or better off but forever renting your future? If you were a startup founder planning to invest in African real estate, what would you do now? Double down? Pull out? Or partner differently? But this story isn't about markets, policies, or projections. It's about something more human. And in the end, that's what matters most. In the end, it wasn't about land. It was about belonging. What Traoré did wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polished for export. But it was honest. Brutally, unapologetically honest. He called out a truth the world pretended not to hear, that millions of people were born on land they'd never legally own, speaking languages that power never bothered to translate. By returning land, not as property, but as a birthright, he didn't just challenge an economic model. He touched something spiritual. He made people believe that home could mean more than rent receipts, bank loans, or investment brochures. Land is not a product. It's a promise, a story, a grave, a seed. And maybe, just maybe, Burkina Faso isn't falling behind. Maybe it's showing the world what it forgot. Do you believe everyone deserves a piece of land they can truly call their own? If that resonates with you, share this story. Comment, debate, and ask the hardest question of all. What kind of world do you want to belong to? Because freedom doesn't always come with a passport. Sometimes it comes with a shovel.